So welcome back, guys. This is chapter 55 and we are on to part 2. And this really is going to focus on kind of the limiting factors to the energy that's going in and flowing through our ecosystems. So all of that energy, as well as the chemical factors for that matter, are limited by what we call primary productivity. And that primary productivity is all wrapped up into our producers, our autotrophs. And so what we're looking at is the amount of energy coming from sunlight, solar radiation, and how are those autotrophs able to convert that light energy into chemical energy via photosynthesis within some given period of time. All right, and that photosynthetic rate is really what's going to set the precedence, the amount of energy that can get spent, if you will, going up the food chain. Okay, so if we think of it kind of as a budget, which is how your text kind of describes all of this, it's a really nice analogy because you can only spend what you make. Okay, there's no credit cards, there's no loans in your ecosystem. So if you're not producing or you're not bringing in enough money at the bottom level, in this case with the energy being brought in and kind of fixed into the sugars and the chemical energy of our producers, then you can't spend more than you've got. Okay? So the amount of solar radiation that's actually getting to Earth's surface and being utilized by these plants for photosynthesis, that output is actually a very small portion of what radiation is actually reaching those organisms. And if you remember anything about photosynthesis, that should make sense. Those plants aren't capable of utilizing the entire spectrum of light that's coming to them. They can only use very limited portions. All right, so we're only capable of utilizing and fixing certain wavelengths of light. Plants can't use it all. Okay, so not only are we limited by how much solar radiation is getting to those plants in the first place, but then we're further limited by the actual wavelengths those plants can utilize to go through photosynthesis. And in some cases, we're not talking photosynthetic organisms, we're talking about those chemotrophs, those organisms who are utilizing some sort of chemical energy to then create their own food. All right, and then you're talking about another set of potential issues. All right, but the same basic principle of what they're able to convert to then get transferred up the food chain is the same basic idea. So if we treat this whole idea as a budget, all right, we can look at the global energy budget of our producers and kind of talk about it as gross primary productivity, which is what that GPP stands for, so the amount of light energy that's actually getting converted into chemical energy by photosynthesis per unit of time, versus the net primary productivity, which is looking at that gross and then subtracting the energy that the producers actually need to do their own respiration. Because remember that your plant cells have both chloroplasts and mitochondria, so they're utilizing their chloroplasts to go through photosynthesis to make those sugar molecules. But in order to do everything else in the plant, they need to respire as well. All right, they need to go through cellular respiration to utilize that sugar that they're creating via photosynthesis to then make ATP for themselves so that they can do the rest of the cellular work that they need to do. Okay, so plants in and of themselves are incredibly self-sufficient, that they can create their own energy and then utilize it for their own purposes. We don't have the luxury of chloroplasts, and so we need to eat other organisms in order to get that glucose so that our body can go through respiration, make the ATP so that our bodies can do the cellular work that they need. Okay? So we can't just look at that gross productivity and say, hey, we can use all of this energy going up the food chain, because that's not really the case. Those plants are going to take some of that energy and use it for themselves. All right, so what's truly available as we go up the food chain is that net production, not the gross. Okay, and so sort of think of it, for those of you who work or know how your parents' paychecks work, it's taking your gross income, all right, what that job is paying you, but you don't get to take all that money home. All right, you've got taxes you've got to pay, maybe health insurance, retirement, whatever, that comes out of your paycheck immediately before you actually get the residuals, all right, or your net paycheck. That's what you get to take home and spend and do whatever with. Okay, so it's sort of that same idea. And so we can look at that net productivity as kind of also the amount of biomass that is getting added in a given time. All right, and for those of you who don't know what biomass is, it's the total mass of organic matter within a particular group of organisms in a particular habitat. AKA, it's sort of how many organisms do you have minus all of their water and their, it's the dry mass. Okay, and so it's that biomass or that net productivity that's actually going to be available going up the food chain. Okay, nothing else, not the gross. So if we take a look at that image there, that is a picture taken from a satellite. Okay, and what they're looking at is sort of mapping out the net productivity within different places on the globe. All right, and it's a satellite image, and satellite imagery, since we've been capable of being up in space, has been really given us some neat images and been a big eye-opener, if you will. But it's kind of interesting, because what we end up seeing is that there's a lot of variation in that net productivity from different ecosystems, and how does that net end up contributing to the globe as a whole. And what we end up finding is that things like your tropical rainforests, your estuaries, your coral reefs, which are both, we know to be very high in diversity, are also very high in productivity. Okay? And we also find, if you take a look kind of at those black areas, that your marine ecosystems are relatively unproductive per area. But because there's so much of it, it actually contributes the most to our global net productivity because of their volume. Okay, so within given areas, our terrestrial ecosystems are actually much more productive, but because those oceans cover so much more space, so much more area, volume even on the globe, they're as a whole much more productive, although within given areas there's almost nothing. Okay. So what we can then take a look at is starting to describe your net ecosystem production. Okay, so what's the total biomass within an ecosystem within a given period? All right, and that is really sort of a measure of looking at your gross production, so total respiration, and comparing the influx of CO2 and influx of oxygen, and comparing how that translates across the ecosystem. Okay, and one of the things that they're really spending some time looking at, particularly with this net ecosystem production, is your oceans, which as a whole are kind of difficult to estimate, but utilizing this and utilizing things like those floats, we can all of a sudden start describing the productivity within oceans by using this ecosystem production rather than just strictly talking about primary production. And what we find is that you really are going to get limited much more by light as well as the nutrients in your aquatic ecosystems versus your terrestrial. And what we end up seeing is in your aquatic ecosystems, obviously, the deeper you go, the less light that penetrates, and so the less productivity you're going to have. Plants, in this case algae and phytoplankton, need the light in order to photosynthesize. The deeper you go, the less of them you're going to have because the less light they have access to. All right. But then you also have limiting nutrients as well. And this goes both on land and in the oceans, or any aquatic ecosystem for that matter. But the elements that have to be added in order for production to increase in a particular area are typically things like your nitrogen and your phosphorus. But what we have to be careful with is that we're dumping a lot of those particular nutrients on land, and then it's getting washed out to sea, and so we're having all sorts of issues with algal bloom. So the productivity is through the roof, but it's also depleting other things like dissolved oxygen in the water, which is necessary for the other trophic levels to exist. All right, which is what this is here. All right, so we're adding those fertilizers, which are high in nitrogen and phosphorus, because our plants, our crops need it, and their corn is particularly bad with pulling those out of our soils, leaching it out of the soils, and so we're adding all of that extra stuff, but we're frequently adding more than we need to. And so those extra nutrients are running off into the groundwater, ending up into our streams and our lakes, our rivers, which ultimately wash out to the oceans. And so we're throwing all of these extra nutrients into the water, causing the phytoplankton, cyanobacteria populations to explode, which is great for them to a degree, but as their populations explode, they're utilizing all of those nutrients going through this eutrophication process. And what ends up happening is that they're pulling all of the oxygen out of the water in order to do their processes, and they're starving the aquatic ecosystems of those other nutrients, the oxygen. And so all the other organisms that are dependent on that oxygen to survive aren't capable of getting it, and so you have all sorts of fish die off and all kinds of other issues. So we can also talk about primary productivity as it relates to more terrestrial ecosystems. And in this case, your climate factors like temperature and moisture are also going to be a major influence on primary productivity, in addition to your nutrients, as well as that incoming solar radiation. And so when we go to compare primary productivity among terrestrial ecosystems, one of the major indicators we can look for is evapotranspiration. So that water that's transpiring from your plants, evaporation there gives us a nice indication as to what the net productivity is. And what you end up seeing is that primary productivity ends up increasing the more evapotranspiration, the more moisture that's available, and that should make sense if you take a look at a graph like this, because here's your tropical rainforests, here's your productivity, they're way up there. Evapotranspiration, they're also pretty far up, versus your deserts, which are virtually transpiring nothing, and so their productivity kind of matches that. And if we take a look on a local scale, your soil nutrients is really often the biggest limiting factor. Okay, and think about our farms and all that kind of stuff, and that should make sense. Typically, your nitrogen and your phosphorus are going to be the most common limiting nutrients, nitrogen being the most common, and then phosphorus sort of following behind that in your kind of older soils. And so what we end up seeing is that there's a lot of plant adaptation that has gone on over generations through evolution to sort of access those limiting nutrients as much as possible. And so we have all sorts of mutualistic relationships with plants having sort of these nitrogen-fixing bacteria or these mycorrhizae fungi that are able to get to the nutrients in the soil a lot more efficiently than the plants can themselves. A lot of plants have root hairs, so if you ever pull up a plant and take a look at their root systems, they'll have these extra little they literally look like hairs, coming off of their roots to sort of increase their surface area. The more surface area they have, the more likely they have access to the nutrients they need. And some of them will even release enzymes into the soil to sort of help break down and get access to those nutrients that they need. Fungi in particular are very good at that enzyme release to get what they need. All right, which is why a lot of plants then have created these mutualistic relationships between them and that fungus in order to help get those limiting nutrients.